In this presentation, we'll talk about the structure of communities, and we typically think of that in terms of food webs. So first, we'll talk about the organization of food webs, just the basic terminology and what we mean when we say a food web. We'll then move on to consider 4 features of food webs that promote their stability or instability. We'll talk about keystone species in food webs and their role in promoting diversity and maintaining diversity. We'll look at 3 different types of interactions that can be diagrammed with food webs. They are not all used for the same things, so it's worth taking a look at what they are used for. And we'll end this presentation by talking about trophic cascades, which are influences on different levels of a food web by subsidizing or removing organisms from another level of a food web. So first, what is a food web and how are they organized basically? Well, here's a picture of a somewhat unusual food web actually. This is the Antarctic marine food web. And one of the really interesting things about it, one of the reasons I want to show it, is because it's kind of different from the way that we think of most food webs. At the bottom of the food web, you have plankton, right? And these are photosynthesizers. Now, we just say diatoms or plankton here. We don't really talk about how many species there are. In fact, there are hundreds of species. And they have different distributions in the Antarctic Ocean. So there's plenty of opportunities for the consumers of plankton to partition this resource. The consumers of the resource are right here. They're krill, they're tiny crustaceans. So these are basically herbivores. And then you have some primary, some secondary consumers that eat the herbivores. Well, now this is interesting because you have some relatively small organisms that eat these tiny krill, but you have the largest organism on Earth, the blue whale, which also eats the krill. And this is really unusual. Normally, consumers get larger as you go up the links in a food web. This is one of the really interesting things about this Antarctic food web. You have some really small guys, and you have the single largest organism on Earth as a primary predator. And yes, since these are animals, we would consider these predators. Then look, you have another layer of predators on top of that. You have Ross seals, Weddell seals, large fish like this cod, and penguins. And then above that, you have yet another level of predators. These are predators of predators. So there you go. You have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 levels of consumers, or 5 levels of organisms in this food web. And this is typically how we try to diagram them. The arrows indicate the direction of energy flow. So this arrow at the bottom means that krill eat diatoms. Blue whales, crab-eater seals, birds, and small fish and squid eat the krill. The only thing that eats blue whales is killer whales. But killer whales also eat Ross seals and leopard seals. So they eat some of these larger mammals. The leopard seal is kind of a really interesting species in this food web because it eats a lot of different things. It eats penguins, it eats both other kinds of seals, and it in fact eats crab-eater seals here, which feed on krill. So the leopard seal has a very broad diet. We'll talk about the consequences of this broad diet for the stability of food webs as part of this presentation. Okay, now normally we make a real effort to enumerate the species on each level. Because there are hundreds of diatoms and other phytoplankton at the base, it's way too complicated. We just lump them together in diatoms. But if we can, we attempt to partition out each species in the location in which it is found. So this is kind of complicated. This is not a very complicated web as far as ecology goes, but it's complicated for us to discuss. Let's just use a simple ball and stick diagram like this to talk about food webs. So what we're really illustrating here is the connections between different trophic levels. Now, what is trophic level? What does that mean? Trophic means feeding, and so these are levels of strategies of gaining energy. At the bottom, you typically have something like producers that photosynthesize, and these are typically plants of some sort. Not always, but for our purposes, we'll generally talk about plants. Here you have what we call primary consumers. They are primary consumers because they don't get their energy from the sun, as plants do, but they get their energy from consuming organisms that do that. So these guys eat plants, therefore they are herbivores. This is a carnivore, or predator, and it is eating the animals that eat the plants. And so you can build more and more levels in a food web. You can have tertiary consumers that eat the predators of the predators. There is a limit to how far you can go. So what we typically use food webs for is to enumerate these vertical linkages. Who eats who? We don't typically use them to talk about relationships within a trophic level. That's competition, and we're really not thinking about competition so much when we talk about food webs. But you'll see these ball and stick diagrams repeatedly in this presentation. Excuse me. Now, let's show what we mean by illustrating the connections. So here's a secondary consumer. It's eating the two primary consumers. Notice it's also eating a plant. That's interesting. That's omnivory, and we'll come back to that. So each level is composed of species that make their living in basically the same way. So you have these guys that are photosynthesizers, these guys that are herbivores, and these guys that are predators right here. So just to reiterate, we're talking about the connections among trophic levels when we talk about food webs. Here you see that species 4 here is exclusively consumed by the herbivore species 2. Here you see species 5 is consumed by both herbivore number 2 and number 3, and that's true for plant number 6 here also. Plant number 7 is exclusively consumed by herbivore 3. Okay, and you can get a tip as to the likelihood of long-term coexistence of individual species at a particular trophic level by looking for these unique relationships. This means that this species here has a resource all to itself that it doesn't have to share. Okay, that's a good thing. So now, really interestingly, you might ask, well, how many trophic levels can you have? And surprisingly, most food webs have either 3 or 4 when we really get down to classifying who's eating who. More than 4 trophic levels is often very unstable for reasons that we'll go into shortly. So here's a real food web, and this is a little bit more complicated than the one that we looked at, but this is more like what food web analysis has to deal with in the real world of ecology. And so this is 10 fish species down here at the bottom, and their consumers, 10 fish species up here, sorry, and their food. And so look, you've got really complicated set of relationships here. So let's make it simpler. Let's take out all the weak relationships. And oh yeah, that's way better, isn't it? Yeah, that's way more interpretable. No, it's not. That's why we're going to use simple example ball and stick diagrams when we talk about this. Real food webs are exceedingly complicated. So, in order to understand the general principles of food webs, we try to simplify these things quite a bit. And our experiments that involve food webs tend to use very simple food webs compared to those that are found in nature. Now, let's talk about some things that confer stability on food webs. And this can be counterintuitive. We've already said that the number of trophic levels that you have can affect stability, and the more levels you have, the less stable your food web is likely to be. Think of it as a Jenga tower. You can easily knock over a tall tower. It's hard to knock over a short tower. There's also the idea that if a food web has different compartments within it, in which species interact mostly with one another and don't interact with other species in other compartments, that tends to confer greater stability. The connectedness between species, surprisingly, because the way that people think about ecology is everything's connected to everything else. No, that's not true. The surviving food webs, in fact, tend to have relatively fewer connections than you might guess. Those that have more connections tend to be less stable. Fewer connections, more stable. Finally, the idea that you'd have omnivores in a food web that would eat from more than one trophic level, like eat both plants and herbivores, that's profoundly destabilizing for reasons that we'll go into here. So let's take these one by one. First, let's look at the number of trophic levels and try to figure out why more is not better. Okay, so here we have a 3 trophic level food web, about as simple as you can get. Here we have a 4 trophic level food web. Increasing from 3 to 4 destabilizes this web, and this one is more likely to have some kind of collapse in it. Now, why is that? Well, think about this predator eating this prey, and this predator eating that prey. You've got a series of linked predator-prey cycles here. And if the predator in one interaction here is eating its prey down to very low levels at the same time that its predator is exerting a lot of predation pressure on this species, then this guy in the middle has the double whammy of having very little food and very high predator pressure. So you can easily go extinct. That is way more likely to happen the more levels you have. The more trophic levels you have, the more unstable predator-prey cycles you have, the more likely it is that you're going to lose one of these levels. Terrestrial food webs typically have 3 in the tropics or 4 in the temperate zone, and that's about as far as it goes. And most people, I think, would wager that you'd have a lot more than that. But that's what we found when we analyze the actual number of trophic levels. In the aquatic systems, you typically have 3 or 4 in very productive aquatic habitats like continental shelf, coral reefs, kelp forests. But in the open ocean, surprisingly, and we won't get to the explanation for this for a couple of lectures, but you can have as many as 5 or 7 even in less productive open ocean. Basically, what you're thinking about here is stacking predators upon predators. So here you might have a plant, here's a deer, here's a coyote. Okay, so here's a plant, here's a deer, here's a coyote, here's an eagle that preys on the coyotes. But are there enough eagles to support a predator of eagles? Would there be enough tigers in the forests of Asia to support a super predator of tigers? Not too likely. So a couple of reasons here. It's just the amount of biomass at each trophic level kind of decreases. And the instability of these stacked predator-prey cycles together with the smaller biomass at each level really puts a limit on how many levels you can have eventually. So, next, compartments. Let's talk about compartments. Compartments within food webs are kind of these self-contained consumer resource units. And notice that this one is completely independent of this one. This is like two different legs on a chair. Notice that this one has no compartments. This chair has one leg. And that's exactly the way we think about it. If we have a loss of one of these species here, it will affect competition with this one and predation by this one. And it will have only an indirect effect on the species in this other compartment. Well, that means that these species are insulated to some extent from drastic changes over here. Here, where every species is connected to every other species, losing one species or changing its abundance greatly affects every other relationship in the entire food web. So let's say that you increase the number of individuals of this one. Well, you increase then the predators of that species. You increase the predators of those predators. They will alter the competitive relationships between these other three species, and there's no telling exactly what the eventual consequence may be. You may have a drastic loss of species due to increased predator pressure on these guys, to increased competition between individuals within this guild, or some combination of altered predator-prey cycles. So here's a different kind of compartment. This is called a feeding guild. These guys compete mostly with each other. They make their living in the same way, but they do not compete with species over here. Now, an example might be grasses and shrubs and herbs and trees. So, yeah, they compete for light, but it's pretty indirect. They mainly compete with other individuals in that guild. Okay, and you can have feeding guilds, too, among the animals. You can have a whole guild of animals that consumes like 40 different, the nectar of 40 different flowers. And so you might have 12 species in a pollinator guild that feed on 40 different plant species. So that's an example of compartmentalization here too. Instead of a vertical compartment, it's a horizontal compartment. But once again, having compartments insulates parts of the food web from drastic changes in another part. Okay, so connectedness. Everything is connected to everything else. Well, no, that's not true. Here is a really interesting example. And what we've got here is 3 pitcher plant food webs. One from the island of Madagascar over here. It's the Seychelles off the coast of Madagascar, tiny little islands. It's a fairly simple food web. One on the island of Madagascar here, which is a lot more complicated. And then one from West Malaysia, which is really complicated. Okay, so look at the number of species and look at the number of guilds. There's producers and consumers. There's 2 guilds here. There's 4 guilds here. There's producers, there's an intermediate consumer, a secondary consumer, and a top consumer. It's 4 guilds. 14 species total, 6 different guilds. 1, 2, still got that intermediate consumer. 3, 4, 5, 6. Now look at the number of links. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. So look, let's divide the number of links by the number of species. Actually, what he's done is kind of divide it by the number of guilds. And he also hasn't shown the complete food web in this diagram because it'd be too complicated. But the number of links per species, look, 3, 2.9, 3.4. The number of links by which a species is connected stays about the same. Now you might think that this more complex food web with more species is more stable, but that's not necessarily true. Having more species is neither stabilizing nor destabilizing. It depends on the number of links that each species experiences. So, the thing to understand then is that if you add species that interact with a lot of other species, that will actually cause a loss of stability. If you add more species but keep the connectedness about equivalent, you are actually then stabilizing communities. So here we see a lot of this in nature where the links per species don't change that much. Okay? But the diversity is quite different. If you increase diversity, the only way that you maintain stability or increase stability is by keeping the linkages constant or even decreasing them. The more individual species are connected to other species, the less stable the food web will be. So adding other species that can make many connections is not necessarily a stable thing to do. Finally, we often have omnivory. And here's an example of an omnivore. It eats a plant and it eats the consumers that eat that plant. So it's eating a species and it's eating its resource, the resource of that species. Well, that's profoundly destabilizing. Here's a parasitoid guild that these guys prey on caterpillars, and here's a fly that lays eggs on something that eats the caterpillar, and it lays eggs on the predator of that same thing. Well, okay, now you're really exacerbating the problem of these stacked predator-prey cycles, because the top predator here could be eating this species down to a minimum at the same time it is eating its food down to a minimum. And then this species will be unable to recover. It'll go extinct because the food of this species is also subsidizing its predator. So this predator doesn't decrease in density as this one, as its prey decreases, because it's got a subsidy from this species. So this is an extreme example of a predator having an alternate prey, which happens to be the prey of its prey. And as this food decreases, this predator decreases as well, but this one can maintain the pressure on both. And if the food reaches a low enough level and the predator pressure doesn't stop, this one can go extinct. So here's an example of some real food webs with their omnivory. Here's an example of a food web that's really kind of unusual. Usually we think of resources as needing to be partitioned, right? And so you've got a plant and you've got a little caterpillar that burrows inside the leaves of the plant. And then you've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 species that eat this little caterpillar. Well, how can 6 species exist on a single resource? Well, they're partitioning the resource temporally, but they're also partitioning the resource because they're omnivores. So the way this works is that these guys are called parasitoids, right? They lay their eggs in the midge, they develop and kill it. These guys are parasitoids of parasitoids. So these guys seek out a midge that has a larva of this parasitoid in it. This species lays its egg in the parasitoid. It eats the parasitoid, hatches out, and then eats the midge. So these are hyperparasites here, and they're tiny, and they're able to partition these midges and maintain the diversity of the community because they're doing it temporally, but also because they're not exclusively relying on this single resource. Okay, here's a much less interesting food web. This is just basically clams and worms. I have no idea what they are. And gastropods. And here's a gastropod that eats some clams and worms and also eats a gastropod that eats the clams and worms. Again, this is stable enough for us to study it. It's not probably stable in the long term evolutionarily. Now let's move on to keystone species. A keystone species exerts a strong effect on the community, regardless of the biomass. And these are generally important species for maintaining the diversity of a community. Okay. Why do we call them keystones? Because in a Roman arch, you have a keystone right here that supports the entire arch. You remove the keystone, the arch collapses. You remove a keystone species from a food web, most of the species go extinct. Okay, so here's an example of the difference between keystone species, which can have relatively low biomass, but their impact is high, versus these dominant species that we sometimes call indicator species, where they have high biomass and they support a lot of energy flow within the community. Okay, so these guys are obvious. These guys are not necessarily obvious. You may not know that you're dealing with a keystone species unless you do an experiment. Keystone species are often top predators or mutualists, and our first studies of keystone species involve top predators. So here are two food webs, one from the coast of Washington State up here and one from the Gulf of California down here. And here is a keystone predator. So this is a starfish. This is a second keystone predator. It's also a starfish. So here's Pisaster, the starfish, and it consumes pretty much every species in this food web with the exception of this one. Okay, bivalves, doesn't consume bivalves. Heliaster also consumes most of the species in the food web, and notice that it consumes species at more than one trophic level sometimes. Okay. Well, what these species are doing is frequency-dependent predation. So whichever of their prey get to be most abundant, they focus on it. Now, what does that do? Well, let's check out what it would do here in the simple food web. If these guys got really abundant, Pisaster would start to eat them, and it would eat them much more than the other species. Well, that would give these species an advantage in population growth. But if they grow too quickly, Pisaster will switch, and it'll feed on the more dominant species here that have grown in response to the low populations here. So what it's doing is basically mediating competition within the food web. Without the keystone species, one of these producers, well, they're not producers, but one of these basal species would likely outgrow the others and cause the extinction of one or more of these other species. But they're all maintained because whichever species grows to dominate the community is the one that the frequency-dependent predator will eat the most, restoring the balance. So, if we remove Pisaster from the intertidal community in Washington State, we lose 3 or 4 species. If we remove Heliaster from this intertidal community in the Gulf of Mexico, we lose 5 or 6 of these species because now competition within a trophic level is unregulated. and one or more of these species can cause the extinction of others. That causes extinctions up the food web. So here's an example of an experiment in which we removed a keystone species. So here's again a starfish. It's not an accident that we do these. These are sessile. They're easy to manipulate. You can remove them and they'll stay removed out of an enclosure. So here's the number of species before the removal of that starfish, and these are little clam and bivalve species. So there are 15 in the community when you have the predator. After you remove the predator, you lose 7 of them. So you've only got 8 left. Here in New Zealand, you had 20 of these bivalve species. After removing the top predator, you lose 6 of them, and you go from 20 to 14. So pretty convincing evidence that keystone species are important in regulating diversity. We will come back to the idea of keystone species when we talk about landscapes, because some species are what we call landscape engineers, and although they're not predators, they are important in regulating diversity, and if you lose them, you lose a lot of species from the community. So, next to last topic, types of interactions that we diagram in food webs. First off, we can just diagram who eats who, right? So in this very simple food web, actually it looks complicated, but it's simple in the because we're simply asking, does this species Catharina eat any of these others? And if it eats any of these others at the lower level, then we draw a line. Okay, so we're not really analyzing what is happening when these species are being eaten by these other species. We're simply saying, all right, this one eats 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 of these taxa down here. Well, that's good, but it doesn't really tell you much about the functioning of the web. It certainly doesn't tell you whether there's likely to be a keystone species. A second use of food webs is to diagram the energy flow. And so here we ignore the interactions that don't transfer a lot of energy. So here Torricella eats Basiella, and we can see that it does that. However, it does not consume enough to transfer any significant amount of energy from this species to Tonicella. Tonicella gets most of its energy from this species, Corallina. Gets a little bit of its energy from Lithothamnion, and almost no energy from anywhere else. Notice that Strongylocentrus here has 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 links when we just look at connectedness, but only 2 of them are even remotely important. It gets most of its energy from drift and a little of it from benthic diatoms. Okay. Neither of these tells you whether there's a keystone species. To see whether there's a keystone interaction, you must actually remove a species and see whether there's a strong effect on the diversity of the community. So we can remove Hedophyllum from this level, and we can determine that there is a strong link between Hedophyllum and these 2 consumers that then alters community structure, causing extinctions in the community. This link here is a keystone link. So this is a functional web. If we remove Strongylocentrus, then some of the energy from Hedophyllum is not transferred here, some from diatoms is not transferred here. Instead, it gets transferred to Catharina, and that then is responsible for extinctions both on this level and on this level. So you can only determine a functional food web by removing serially one of these species and asking, is the diversity of the web maintained aside from the removal of this species? If you remove one and you lose 3 or 4, that's what these strong links are explaining. So Acmea is not important. Tonicella is not important. This acmia is unimportant in maintaining the diversity of the community, but Strongylocentrus and Catharina are. If you remove either one of these, you get extinctions. And that's not predictable from either the connectedness web or the energy flow web. This you observe simply by asking who's eating who. This is determined by doing a quantitative measure. How much of this is being eaten by each of these? But this can only be determined by an experiment, actually removing the species and seeing whether diversity is maintained or lost. Now, what we're looking at here so far is diversity. What we want to look at now is biomass. And to do that, we examine trophic cascades. In a trophic cascade, the biomass or abundance at one trophic level affects the biomass or abundance at all other trophic levels. So here is a bottom-up trophic cascade. If you increase the productivity of the plants at the bottom, you increase the amount of these little insects that are the food supply for a number of other insects, and they increase in turn, and they increase the amount of these larger fish. So this is what we call a bottom-up trophic cascade. The availability of the plants at the bottom automatically increases the biomass of these other levels. Well, that's interesting. What about top-down trophic cascades? What happens if the abundance of the predators affects these guys? That could be more interesting. Here is a top-down trophic cascade. In a top-down trophic cascade, trophic levels change in opposite directions when the predators change. So here, we're going to look at the top predator. We're going to look at fish. So we're going to look at the fish, and we're going to look at algae. Okay, so here's two types of algae, Cladophora and Nostoc. And here is the amount of algae when we have fish that are enclosed in a little enclosure, or fish that are excluded from that enclosure. Now, the fish aren't eating the algae. So how is this working? Well, if we enclose the fish, they eat the zooplankton. They actually increase the prey of the zooplankton. Okay, so zooplankton eat these herbivorous animals. Zooplankton are predators. Fish are top predators. They eat the predators. Fish eat zooplankton. Zooplankton eat the herbivores. And so if you enclose fish, they will eat the zooplankton. That will increase the number of herbivores. Oh, I'm sorry, I've got the wrong side here. This is the enclosure. So you increase the density of the herbivores because you've consumed all of their predators. Well, okay, if herbivores don't have predators anymore and the fish aren't eating the herbivores, then the herbivores are left to absolutely destroy the algae. If you exclude fish, then you have very few herbivores because you have lots of predators of the herbivores. The fish eat the predators eat the herbivores. So with no fish, you get more predators, fewer herbivores, and much more algae. Okay, now, trophic cascades bear a little extra examination. It's important to understand that bottom-up trophic cascades are kind of general subsidies. If you increase the producer level, you're going to generally increase the biomass at all levels. If you decrease the producer biomass, you're going to generally decrease the biomass at all trophic levels. And that does not depend on the number of trophic levels. That'll be a general subsidy. So if you increase producer biomass, everything else increases. However, if you have a top-down trophic cascade, this is really common in nature. You don't get exactly the same pattern. Here are those opposing effects. So here's a situation in which we're increasing the density of predators. The predators eat the herbivores, and they decrease. Since the predators don't eat producers, and the producers no longer have herbivores, they increase. If you decrease predators, then the herbivores increase and they eat out the plants. But that's at 3 trophic levels. What happens if you have 4 trophic levels? If you have a top predator, then it's eating the predators. If you increase the top predator, it will eat more of the predators, which will leave more of the herbivores, which will leave less of the producers. If you reduce the number of top predators in a 4-level trophic web, then you increase the number of predators, which decreases the herbivores, which increases the amount of plant biomass. So basically, we can tell whether we've got a top-down or a bottom-up trophic cascade by looking at what happens if we increase or decrease the top trophic level. If we increase the top trophic level and we get alternating effects at lower levels, we've got a top-down cascade. If we don't, then maybe what we have is a bottom-up cascade. We would determine that by enhancing the lowest level and just seeing if we increase everybody equally all the way up the trophic level. But this is a really interesting thing. If you increase the top level in a 3-level trophic web, you get the opposite change as you do if you increase the top level in a 4-level trophic web. In each case, the top level decreases the level below it, but in this case, the top level is decreasing predators. In this case, the predators are decreasing herbivores. Decreasing the predators here actually increases herbivores. So I'm sure this is kind of a brain teaser for you. Give it some careful thought and ask questions about it when you get the chance.